I would say technology is the means by which humans adapt our environments to meet our needs and wants. So those means could be physical technologies, digital, biological technologies. They could even be social technologies if you want to think about things like legal systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
The environments can be our natural environment, but they could also be our social environment, our political environment. And so if you go back to Marshall McLuhan is often credited with saying, we shape our tools and our tools shape us. You can just replace technologies, and we shape our technologies and our technologies shape us. We've been co-evolving with our technology since the beginning of humanity.
You are listening to the Humanity in the Loop podcast.
Welcome to the Humanity in the Loop podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My guest today is Mark Abbott. Never in human history has technological change caused such a fundamental shift in the world's systems. The speed, scope, and complexity of this change is opening previously unimaginable risks and opportunities. This is the call to action of the Engineering Change Lab, where Mark is director. Mark also leads Tech Stewardship at the Mars Discovery District, an organization that aims to identify and promote ways to imagine, design, and implement technology intentionally for positive impact. Mark, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So, Mark, you are a professional engineer. What drew you to that field?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking about this just the other day with a friend, and oddly, I kind of went into engineering without knowing a lot about what engineering was. In high school, I was a bit math and science, and so the counselors say, "Oh, have you thought about engineering? What's engineering?" And at the time, I kind of had this sense of, here's create things and build things, and that was appealing to me. And it was challenging. And, at the time as a teenager, probably over hubris, I was like, I want something hard and challenging. So I dove into engineering education, did my undergraduate at UBC in mechanical engineering. And in hindsight, kind of got into the program, and you're focusing on passing the math exam or doing the design project, and kind of had my head down, just sort of clearing the hurdles. And never really sort of kind of stopped to think about, answer that question I had at the beginning, like, what is engineering anyway? It just kind of became what it was was in front of me.
Well, that's interesting because you went on to have a successful career in a heavy industrial consulting engineering firm for many years. But since then, you have led or contributed to efforts that are shaping the way engineering and technology gets deployed. What provoked that shift?
Yeah, so straight out of school, I went into consulting engineering, and a pretty, I'd say, typical engineering path, if there is such a thing. Like, one of the things that drew me to engineering was, there are so many different things you could do with it. That being said, I think a lot of people in Canada wind up on a lot of engineers in Canada follow like that consulting engineering path, where, when I came out of school, I joined a company. It was about 30 people. Started out with the sort of design engineering, get into project engineering, project management, did an MBA along the way, part-time, shifted more into the business work. So I had almost 15-year first career in consulting engineering. And it was kind of a continuation of the education, in that it was always just like kind of head down, what's the next project, move fast, going. And during that time, things would come up that would kind of, I'd have a question about whether or not we should take this job or some issue on a certain project, but there was never time to stop. And when we did try to stop and bring it up, we didn't have language for it. So it felt kind of lonely, almost sort of trying to, there's these things in the back of my mind, these things that are bothering me, but, felt lonely and kind of isolated in terms of doing anything with it. About 10 years into that first 15 years, I wound up connecting with the Vancouver professional chapter of Engineers Without Borders, the national nonprofit. And all of a sudden, there was this group of people that were asking these bigger questions that had always been inside of me. It's like, wait a minute, what's the world you want to see, and how does your work relate to that? And so I went from kind of dipping a toe in to, like, at the end of sort of 5 years of volunteering with them, at the end of my 15-year sort of first career, I was spending more time on the volunteer work with Engineers Without Borders than the high-paid, cushy leadership role in this consulting firm. And so that became kind of like finally I couldn't ignore that anymore. So in 2011, I moved from Vancouver to Toronto to join the executive team of Engineers Without Borders.
So there's a couple of themes. One in particular is this idea of being heads down. Now, I'd never practiced as an engineer. I did train as an engineer. I have an engineering degree, and you would think I knew what I was getting into, because the reason I got into it was my father was an engineer. But it turned out to be much more math, I think, than I anticipated. So I got through, but it was a tough slog. But this idea of being heads down, there, at least at the time, and I think you're younger than I am, but we're roughly contemporary. It was very much engineering is the best field on earth. It's the only important field on earth. And the idea of civic mindedness just didn't show up in the textbooks.
Right.
And a perfect example of that was the class president that we had. I remember one year we had a class president vote, and it was the person who won had voted for themselves. And that was it. Like, there was so little civic mindedness that we didn't even show up to vote for our class president. And so this theme that you're bringing up, which is as much that we need to lift our heads from our drafting tables, so to speak, definitely resonates. And so at this point, you are leading two efforts. One is called the Engineering Change Lab, and the other is called Tech Stewardship. How do the scope of these two differ?
Yeah, and then maybe to answer that, I'll go back even further in the roots. So Engineers Without Borders was started back in 2000 by George Roeder and Parker Mitchell, who are about basically exactly my age. They were University of Waterloo graduates. And building on what you were saying, like when they first brought Engineers Without Borders into the world, it was they kind of caught the wind. It was like before Engineers Without Borders, the idea of engineers kind of having more of that civic minded, like, working in international development and everything wasn't really a thing in the same way. And also back in 2000, the idea of sort of student-led kind of initiatives that were really kind of doing progressive work was also not as prevalent. And so the early days of Engineers Without Borders, there was this really kind of big push where chapters popped up at all the different engineering schools across the country. And there was this real kind of amazing kind of community of student leaders, and then eventually kind of, young professionals kind of infusing engineering across Canada. And it was part of an even, larger global movement. So that's what I kind of caught up with in around would have been like 2006, 2007. So I've been going for a while. And so I was one of those people where it was always in me. And finally there was this kind of, a community around that to engage with. And so when I joined the executive team, when I went from being a volunteer to join the executive team in around 2011, one of the mandates of Engineers Without Borders had always been, there was the overseas kind of international development sort of side, but there was also the sort of reform and of evolution of engineering itself was always, part and parcel of it. And so after spending a few years on the executive team at Engineers Without Borders, and we'd done a lot of really interesting work in what was called global engineering and other kind of, more civic-minded kind of engineering modes. And we got to this point in around 2014 when we were sort of saying, okay, Engineers Without Borders itself has done a lot to kind of, change this sort of civic-minded kind of focus of engineering, bring kind of a new ethos in engineering. But kind of what's next? Like, it feels like it still feels like there's a lot of kind of next potential. And the stars kind of aligned back around 2014, 2015, where we were feeling like, okay, there's lots of great initiatives going on around engineering and engineering reform, but they sometimes feel a little bit stuck. It's like we've been talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion for 20, 30 years in engineering. We've been talking about connecting engineers to big grand challenges and the SDGs. We've been talking about curriculum reform. And the sense was that it was almost like all these initiatives were working on pieces of a puzzle without the box cover that sort of told the larger story of how it all connected. And so the stars kind of aligned in 2014, 2015, where there was enough leaders, not just from Engineers Without Borders, but other key organizations that were sort of feeling like we needed to try something different. And so Engineers Without Borders and Engineers Canada wound up co-convening the Engineering Change Lab. And we followed a social labs methodology, which is about, a way of actually bringing about larger systems change. So, systems change like this, like most of the world's big problems are bigger than any one organization. Even if it's the federal government, they can't be solved or even perceived, in kind of silos of individual organizations. So social labs is a way of sort of, collaborating across silos to work at a sort of more systemic level. So we applied the social labs methodology to the future of engineering. And tangibly, what that looked like is we went out to convene a microcosm of engineering in Canada. So we were looking at sort of leaders from academia, industry, government, professional associations, nonprofits, VPs, CEOs, directors, deans. And we launched the Engineering Change Lab in January of 2015 with 40 leaders from 40 organizations sitting in a circle in a conference room in Montreal. And that story continues to unfold 8+ years later. We've morphed and changed. We've had hundreds of leaders and hundreds of organizations involved in the core work over the years, and it sort of impacted thousands more. But that was sort of the impetus of the launch of the Engineering Change Lab. What emerged over time, like, when I was talking about sort of like the pieces of the puzzle in the box cover. So we started out working on the pieces of the puzzle collaboratively. And what we sort of realized was the box cover was this realization that the strengths of engineering have become its weaknesses. Like, hey, we're practical problem solvers. We don't have time for all that philosophical crap about who we are and our place in the world. Just give us your problem. Let's get to work. Right. That's a strength until you overdo it to the extent that the modern engineering profession has, where, even if you ask like deans of a lot of engineering schools or CEOs of engineering companies, what is engineering? You tend to actually get pretty unsatisfactory answers. Like, in practice, somehow, like, the further you are from, doing calculations by yourself in the dark room, somehow the less it's real engineering, and so we have this kind of almost sort of felt understanding of what is real engineering without ever really interrogating it. In promotion, you get what I used to say in Engineers Without Borders when people said, well, where's the engineering in Engineers Without Borders? Well, engineering is a mindset. Engineers are problem solvers. That's true, but you could really say that about any profession or discipline. They have different mindsets that are sort of bespoke to different types of problems and challenges. What's unique, I think, about engineering relative to other disciplines and professions is the degree to which engineers are unself-aware about the nature of the problems and the nature of the mindset that we've been that we've developed as engineers or been sort of supported to develop.
So a couple of things jump out from that too, and that is, you were talking about Engineers Without Borders. Not only does that imply an international interest, but it's also a way of announcing you're unconstrained yourselves, right? Yeah. That is probably. It sounds to me like what you're saying is that engineering shouldn't have limits in terms of connecting with other disciplines, but also embracing other disciplines in tech. Yeah. Right. Because I'm old enough to remember when I have a certified Novell engineer certification. And I remember when actual engineers, and I had just graduated from being an actual engineer, bristled at the use of that term. It was like, no, we're engineers and you're not. Yeah. And so it's interesting that by lifting the borders, in a sense, you are embracing all kinds of tech.
Yeah, and the way that we lifted that border was like the basic re-realization, like the root question, what is engineering? And you get like lots of really pedantic answers or unsatisfactory answers. At a fundamental level, what we came to is engineering is the process of creating technology. Mm-hmm. Okay, if that's engineering, what's technology? Mm-hmm. The nice thing about reestablishing that link is engineering overall is very siloed. When I was working in engineering consulting, it was all engineers. And when I finally did my MBA, it was kind of, realizing that the biggest problem with our engineering consulting firm wasn't that the level of engineering, it was that was a bunch of engineers doing business without realizing what they didn't know about business. Right. So there's almost a little bit of an arrogance sometimes and like, oh yeah, we can figure out marketing, we can figure out operations. And so for me, my awakening about, how much I'd been trained to think in a very particular way came 8-10 years into my career when I was doing an executive MBA with a bunch of people who weren't engineers and who'd been trained to think in different ways and everything. But more broadly speaking, I think what keeps engineering in its silo, like if there's a conference on the future of engineering, it's going to be engineers talking to other engineers about the importance of engineering. And if only we had more engineers in decision making, if only there were more engineer politicians, it's such a siloed conversation. When you reconnect engineering to technology in this fundamental way, it connects engineering into this larger story of technology in society. And that's a story that everyone finds their place in, as they should, right? Like when we go to the movies or when we read like stories of the future, they're almost always directly or indirectly cautionary tales about getting our relationship with technology wrong. So, The Matrix, WALL-E, Black Mirror on Netflix is a whole anthology of near future sort of failures of tech innovation, right? And so, reconnecting engineering to technology kind of breaks down those silos. And one of the consequences of the silos is we don't get a lot of critical friendship from outside. So, when a bridge falls down, it's like, okay, engineering will get scrutinized. When Facebook does the Cambridge Analytica scandal, no one talks about engineering anymore because is that engineering? I'm not sure. And, I think people on the outside don't criticize engineering because they're not confident enough about what engineering is and isn't to make a criticism. What they don't realize is that people within engineering aren't confident enough about what engineering is and isn't. So we get this kind of state where there's a scenario in the future where engineering becomes first and second industrial revolution physical technologies with micro ethical sort of bridge falls down kind of problems, while new technology becomes computer science or some sort of unofficial engineering, and all of the really kind of macro ethical issues around privacy and all the things around generative AI somehow separate into this new world. And I'd say that's actually in a way almost where the default seems to be going right now, where a lot of our institutions of engineering seem to be sort of stuck. Sometimes you could argue not even the second industrial revolution. It's like back to the first industrial revolution where it's like an engineer stamping ad drawings so a bridge doesn't fall down. Those are not the biggest risks and challenges around modern engineering if you take engineering in that bigger sense as the process of creating technology.
So again, coming back to the experience I had in engineering, there was definitely even snobbery between different disciplines within engineering, let alone hanging out with the nursing crew or the architecture crew. Heavens no, right? Yeah. And my favorite metaphor, one of my favorite metaphors is the peanut butter cup, right? For it's a fusion of peanut butter and
right. Yeah.
And it's two different disciplines coming together to find a way that's really productive. Totally. You still need people who are working on making good chocolate, and you still need people who are working on making good peanut butter, but there has to be an opportunity for that connection to be right. And it sounds like that's one of the themes that comes from your work.
And what makes those connections work at scale is people's self-awareness of what they're bringing to the table and what others are bringing to the table, right? So if we wanted to be critical, if I wanted to be critical of the modern engineering profession, let's say engineering community broadly, because I would say engineering, computer science, certain hard sciences, technologists, there's a lot of kind of messiness around what is science and what is engineering and everything too. So if we're talking broadly about the fields that create and scale technology, so engineering, computer science, business scaling a lot of the technologies, we tend to train those people on one side of campus to create and scale technology. Somewhere on the other side of campus, we're training a different group of students to think critically about the nature of technology and its impacts on society in philosophy of technology, science technology studies, critical media studies. And those groups rarely meet. And when they do, not only are they speaking a different language, they have a different kind of culture. I went into engineering because I want to get stuff done, and you philosophers just want to talk about stuff. I don't have time for you, right?
Stop it.
Right. And so the peanut butter and the chocolate stay separate, right? And so if you wanted to be critical of the engineering community, broadly speaking, it's kind of set up to turn out Dr. Frankensteins right now. So in Mary Shelley's a classic book, Dr. Frankenstein was the doctor, not the monster. So the doctor had the ability to create something, in this case, technology, that he didn't adequately understand the nature of or have the ability to steward responsibly. So you get this thing in engineering where it's like, well, I'm a good person. I have good intentions, and I've been told I have a magical mindset that can solve problems. So as long as I care about climate change and I go in that direction, then I'm doing my part. And it's sort of almost like a super narrow way of thinking about ethics. That would be eviscerated by, anyone with kind of any social science ethics background. Good intentions are not enough. In fact, more problems and so you hear a lot in engineering, it's well, I'm good, and we have to guard against those bad actors over there. At an aggregate level, more problems have been created by naive techno-optimists, the type of naive techno-optimists that we turn out by default from engineering, that have been created by bad actors, just because there are so many more naive techno-optimists than there are bad actors out there.
So let's talk about that a little bit. I think you and I have shared this sort of meme. Jeff Goldblum is often quoted for this line from the movie Jurassic Park: "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." That's the worst Jeff Goldblum impression that I ever hear. But what are some real life examples of this dynamic at play? Like you're talking about technology run amok that people didn't think about the consequences. What are some examples?
Yeah, I mean, the huge one that's on everyone's mind right now is obviously generative AI and ChatGPT. And people will argue that we've just launched the largest, social experiment ever, at scale, right? With the number of people who are using it. Jeffrey Hinton, the one of the, I guess they call him a godfather of AI, was recently speaking at Collision, the conference in Toronto, and he made the point that for every 99 smart people that are working on like scaling, and using generative AI, there's one smart person talking about how to make sure it doesn't, have us wind up in a Black Mirror episode. I'll use that as a shorthand, right? And so this concept of well, I guess reversing for a second, because I'll talk about the genesis of tech stewardship, because that brings us into this can we do it, should we do it dynamic we're talking about. So when we were kind of coming out of the engineering silo as the engineering change lab, a few years into it, it was around 2018, the time of the first Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal. Remember, around kind of voting and that in hindsight almost feels like one of these kind of seminal moments that sort of was a bit of an awakening. So we use the metaphor to the environmental movement. So the 1960s is when society broadly started to wake up to the nature of our relationship with nature, and the environmental movement continues to unfold. So the beginning of that was actually an awareness of the scope of the problem of, and we think that now, starting with like kind of Cambridge Analytica, and now with like the release of generative AI, there's these kind of seminal moments, just like there were in the environmental movement, the blue marble, like Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. We're seeing these new seminal moments that are marking the awakening of society to the nature of our relationship with technology. And so we think it's kind of like, it's a 1960s moment. So there's some people that are seeing it are kind of early, but in general public, it's kind of like, well, what are you talking about, right? Imagine you were in 1960s, you're trying to talk to people about the environment. Like, why is environmental sustainability an issue? Because the technologies we've developed as a species over time have so at a fundamental sense, I would say technology is the means by which humans adapt our environments to meet our needs and wants. So those means could be physical technologies, digital, biological technologies. They could even be social technologies if you want to think about things like legal systems, right? Mm-hmm. The environments can be our natural environment, but they can also be our social environment, our political environment. And so if you go back to Marshall McLuhan is often credited with saying, we shape our tools and our tools shape us. You can just replace technologies, and we shape our technologies and our technologies shape us. We've been co-evolving with our technology since the beginning of humanity. Social scientists have pointed out that when humans started using fire to pre-digest our food, over centuries, we actually evolved less strong jaws. So even our physical evolution has been entwined with our technological evolution. But it's been happening at such a slow pace and in such a diffuse way that it hasn't been apparent. What's changed more recently, because of the power and pace of technological development, is it's becoming more apparent. What's always been true is the nature of this intricate co-evolution. And so, things like generative AI, the latest digital technologies tend to kind of shine the biggest light on it, but it's also true of, fire and the earliest technologies, right? And so the degree to which we become more intentional in shaping that co-evolution will, determine, do we wind up in like a Star Trek Next Generation kind of positive, technological future, or in one of these many like dystopian kind of tech future scenarios.
Yeah, like a Blade Runner.
Yeah, exactly.
You used the word lonely earlier on. That there can be a loneliness from feeling like you're the only person wrestling with these issues in an industry or a profession that doesn't necessarily think very much about it. There's a quote from the Tech Stewardship website: "Too often our work conflicts with our values, and too often we feel isolated and powerless to change that dynamic." What role does Tech Stewardship, the organization, play in uniting people with that sensation?
Yeah, so as we were coming into this bigger tech and society conversation in this 1960s moment and seeing this gap, we started prototyping this concept of tech stewardship in response, because we didn't find it when we came out of the silo. We had to create it. And so tech stewardship as a mindset, as an identity, as a practice. And so we're kind of creating almost like a frame for that identity and for that practice, right? And we have now some programming, like some early programming that we're evolving to help people launch that practice, to develop that identity. And at the heart of it is three core commitments. The first is to advance understanding about the nature of technology and kind of disabuse dangerously limited narratives and stereotypes. So, that point I was talking about before, where we're turning out Dr. Frankenstein's. It's like, all right, let's make sure that everyone that we're supporting to have the ability to create technology also understands the nature of that technology, not at a technical level, like that's already happening, but at an impact level. Like what is, and so one of the common misconceptions is that technology is neutral, when in fact, I would argue that our values shape and are shaped by technology, which leads to the second core commitment of tech stewardship, which is to deliberate values, to understand like, what are my values? What are the values of others? What are those in tension? So a very common value tension that we use to bring people into that is cell phones, right? Like we all struggle, we all value convenience, we all value privacy, and we probably feel tension when we're using our cell phones around that, around those different values being kind of conflict. And, and of course, the way systems have been set up have kind of leaned that in a certain direction. In general, all of the innovation around cell phones to date has kind of gotten us to give up privacy in favor of convenience, right? But does it need to be that way? If we understand that's what's happening, can we find more opportunities where there's a both and, where you get the best of convenience and privacy without having to trade one off against the other? You mentioned before, like the meta tension we see in technology, the value tension is between that can we do it, should we do it mindset that we drew from Jurassic Park, right? And so you get can we do it, I think we all have can we do it and should we do it inside us, but you get sort of in different settings more of a leaning one way or the other. Engineering, business, innovation hubs tend to be very can we do it and should be. Like that's there's lots of great things about a can we do it mindset. The problem is when you only focus on can we do it to the exclusion of should we do it, is when you get the really negative consequences and, getting eaten by dinosaurs or whatever and then, but conversely, there are communities and groups that have more of the should we do it leaning, like, in general, the social sciences, government, nonprofits, and, social and should we do it thinking has lots of power too about ensuring, broad benefits, taking more of a long-term systemic look. But if you overdo should we do it to the exclusion of can we do it, you get analysis paralysis and all these problems. So what we're saying with tech stewardship is we need the best of both can we do it and should we do it coming together. We need, so we need to break down that silo between the engineering and the philosophy department. We need to and sort of recognize that the peanut butter and the chocolate have to come together in order to get this, the future that we really want to see. And so the third core commitment, so advancing understanding, deliberate values, and then the actual practice of the behaviors is sort of where the rubber hits the road. And that's where, to your lonely comment, the essence of tech stewardship, we create that frame, but the real essence of it is connecting people so that they can work through those day-to-day, like, in my context, where is that opportunity for me to help bend the arc? Because I think the bottleneck in my mind is not people caring about these issues. I think people care about equity and climate change and all these things. And it's not even that they don't have tools in their toolkit to do something about it. There's lots of, different toolkits out there and lots of capacity. The bottleneck is people not being able to find opportunities in their day job or their day-to-day life where they feel like they have, utility to actually do something about it. And so that's where that third core commitment of like, how do we find those opportunities day to day? And how do we connect people so they can support each other to find those day-to-day opportunities?
So there's a couple of flies in the ointment when taking that viewpoint that I'm sure you've thought of. The first is that innovation involves risk.
Right.
You have to be experimental. And
sure.
So how do we balance a tendency to say do no harm versus let's try things and see how they go? How does stewardship address that?
So the essence of tech stewardship practice is being able to notice the tensions around technology that are around us, name them, reflect on them, and then take action within them. So we have the meta, can we do it, should we do it tension, but we kind of, as we introduce people to tech stewardship, we kind of peel the onion a little bit so that you get some more of these sort of like typical tensions that by knowing what the typical tensions are, it's easier to spot them day to day. And so there's 4 behaviors of tech stewardship that all have tensions around them. So as tech stewards, we seek purpose, we take responsibility, we expand inclusion, and we work to regenerate. So the tension that you're hitting there a lot is around take responsibility. So if you think about sort of within take responsibility, if I'm more of a can we do it learning person, right? I'm going to value more action, right? It's like, hey, if I have the ability to make something better, it'd be irresponsible of me not to do it as quickly as possible, which is not wrong until you overdo that type of thinking to the exclusion of should we do it thinking. Now, on the should we do it side of sort of take responsibility, there's more this like valuing of reflection. And so someone with a should we do it leaning might say, okay, well, if I'm going to help bring this like powerful technology into the world that's going to have all these impacts, I better make sure I thought through what all those impacts are before we do anything. It's called the precautionary principle, which is not wrong until you overdo it in the wrong context. And so context is really important here, right? If you're talking about, that sort of action, reflection, leaning, and, and the consequences, the potential risks are relatively low, then the leaning might be in one direction. But if they're relatively high, so it's not a simple one-time, answer. It's an ongoing practice of knowing, of reflecting of the situations you're in. And wait a minute, are we leaning too far towards, action here and not reflecting enough? Or are we leaning too far the other way? And, and building that individual and kind of group awareness of where we are in that. I would say with generative AI, like the big topic on everyone's mind right now, the overall sort of sense is that we've leaned a little bit too far towards action. And now there's like a lot of sort of concern about, wait a minute, but the horse is kind of like, leaving the barn as we speak, right?
Yeah. So you're making me think, and I don't know if I'm using this term correctly, but satisficing. The art of trying to find a solution that satisfies multiple metrics.
Right.
And when you talk about engineers being problem solvers, really what you're doing in a way is inviting people to identify other problems or potential problems to bring to the engineer's attention, to say it's not just whether the car can make it from Boston to Chicago in one piece. It's also have you thought about the risk to the other people on the road?
Yeah. And this is where the sort of deeper philosophy of tech stewardship, and that connects it, I think, to even larger themes. When we were developing tech stewardship, we were talking about tech stewardship is sort of this practice that helps ensure technology is beneficial for all. And we debated a lot, beneficial for all. Mm-hmm. What does that even mean, right? And who is all? And so it was meant, beneficial for all is meant more as like a North Star. Like you never achieve benefit for all, but it's important to always be tracking towards it, like considering who the all is, considering what benefit is, right? And even the term problem. So we partnered with a group called Polarity Partnerships, and we introduced people into a methodology of mapping out value tensions. And what Polarity Partnerships and that whole methodology sort of says is a lot of like the biggest intractable problems in the world are intractable because they're not problems. They're actually value tensions to be managed, not problems with solutions. Right. And so the can we do it, should we do it? It's not a can we do it or should we do it? It's a both. The convenience and privacy, it's not an either or, it's both. And it's how you navigate that in sort of a dynamic way that's actually more important. And so there's actually, coming back to engineering, there's actually a documented phenomenon called the myth of rationality in engineering. There's a great Harvard Business Review article that's titled "How the rationality of engineering is hurting engineering and diversity and engineering itself." And it talks about this researcher named Aaron Seck that quoted her work in this article about documenting this phenomenon of the myth of rationality in engineering. And the observation is that it's not an intentional indoctrination. It's more something that seeps into the engineering journey, where there's this belief that there's always a rational right decision. And if you just, it's almost like part of that kind of, engineers are awkward, right? It's like, well, because we don't get all kind of caught up in that human emotion, just give us, we're more rational. Just give us the data and we'll tell you the rational right answer. But what's being missed in that is like, what that actually means is the dominant values of engineering are taken as the right answer. And so tech stewardship is actually about understanding like different people value different things, and actually, better engineering, better technology does a better job of finding the both ends between those different kind of solutions, rather than sort of defaulting to engineering dominant values. Our physical, digital, biological worlds, like the places with sort of artifact-based technology, have been shaped with a dominant set of values, of engineering values, that have been sort of privileged and propagated in the world in a very powerful way. Some people talk about, like, if you compare it to like politics, right? in political world and governance, right, we sort of accept that we all, every citizen has a vote. And yeah, there's politicians and policymakers and people who play particular roles, but these decisions are too important and they need to be made democratically. You could argue that technology has a different, but potentially even greater impact on our lives, the way our sort of physical, digital, biological worlds are shaped. And yet there's no sense of democratic participation. There's a small group of a small engineering community that has a dominant set of values that's shaping that technological world without even realizing the power they're wielding, or the fact that we're embedding and privileging our own values to the exclusion of others.
So I want to pick up on that theme, because to me, it sounds like one of the reactions to that is regulation. So I want to get to that, but I also want to give you the other fly in the ointment that strikes me. And I'm a fan. I didn't call the podcast Humanity in the Loop.
Yeah.
without thinking that this is the right approach to take. However, it does create the risk of putting individuals or individual firms at a competitive disadvantage. So human-centered design is promoted as a creative approach to problem solving that begins with the final user and ends with innovative solutions. This is a craze. I've actually been a big fan of design thinking, because every sort of mindset or philosophy or process is a reaction to a problem. And the problem was, when you gave somebody an assignment, they would go back to their cubicle and solve it without consulting with the people who are affected by it.
Sure.
The thing is that primacy of the end user, which is great for a company that wants to make money selling things, it is a pressure that on the system, and creates these lonely people who wish they could look up from their desk and say, how can I make this work for a better world? What do you say to people who are concerned that if they take this viewpoint and if they adopt the mindset of tech stewardship, there's going to be a company that succeeds against them?
Yeah. You're describing the headwind, right? I think that underlying belief is the thing that holds back progress overall, right? And when we talk about can we do it, should we do it? Like, can we do it tends to be, utilize resources, like draw them down to create benefit for your focused stakeholder, your customer, your client. Whether it's like best practices in business, like be obsessed with your customer, right? Or whether it's human-centered design, there's strength in all of those. Like this is the thing that makes it subtle, right? Like that's a powerful way of thinking until you overdo it to the exclusion of the should we do it sort of thinking in that context, right? And people will look at certain models like Facebook, right? It's like, obviously Facebook has kind of exploited sort of like in a sort of privacy sort of convenience, or, like, why have we allowed Facebook to cause these problems in the world, right? Because it's adding a huge amount of value. Like, we're basically saying all of the things that it's given us are worth all of this pain, right?
It's worth the kidding videos.
Right. And it's made billionaires and all of this sort of stuff, right? And you can slip back into that. Well, if consumers are paying for it, they must value it, kind of, even if it's bad for them, right? But there's few businesses that sort of have slipped that accountability knot, where they've like exploited a value tension like that and made, billionaires and everything, right? Most startups, most organizations will get kind of hit on the rocks of that much earlier, right? Like, you look at with generative AI, the biggest challenges coming up right now are not technical. They're questions around the socio-technical and like the social license to operate, right? So I think the underlying paradigm shift that needs to flip to really kind of change this is that ignoring those tensions is not better business, it's worse business, right? Like, it's actually the organizations that are ahead of these stewardship concerns and understanding those dynamics and making wise choices are better organizations. There's an analogy here to the health and safety movement. So, I worked in heavy industry for a long time, but you could also look at sort of general construction. If you went back 50 years and, spoke to the average person on a construction site, like, what about health and safety? Probably you would have heard something like, well, we try to be safe, but it's a business and things happen, right? Like, that was the accepted mindset, right? And that's what people thought was, good business back then, right? A lot of things changed over time, because now if you go to like an average sort of construction site in North America, or, most places in the world, where, what about health and safety? Health and safety is number one. It's like tattooed into people's minds, right? Now, a lot of things changed, regulation, other things, but I would argue the fundamental thing that changed was the realization that it wasn't an either or, that a safely run organization is actually a better run organization, a more profitable organization. And so when that tips, all of a sudden, all the weight of industry and all the weight of all those resources go into figuring out how to do health and safety well. And you get really sophisticated takes on health and safety where it's not just, we need to put in a handrail, we need to put in a fail safe in our software. They realize that actually to really do health and safety well, you have to invest in the health and safety culture is your actual asset. So you get super sophisticated investment in health and safety because of the paradigm shift. And what you just described is, I think, the reason is the underlying faulty belief right now that limits investments in essentially tech stewardship is this erroneous belief that ignoring these value tensions are related to technology is going to allow you to do better or even move faster. Because I would say that it might seem faster, but it's actually not, to ignore these things and not be ahead of them.
So a couple of the themes there that draw to mind the Toyota production system. It more than the North American automotive industry, they were interested in avoiding scrap waste, right? Well, that's just the cost of doing business. Well, no, it isn't. You need to reduce that because you're actually better off as a business.
Yeah.
The people getting injured is bad for business, and if you have that kind of if you have people getting injured, it means your system is not running right.
Yeah.
And so you have this lean production, and so you're right. There are opportunities. There are occasions when the stars align, and it's not only good for the individual, it's good for the company and for society. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that's always true.
Yeah.
And that's where regulation comes in, because you were talking about how we engage in behavior that isn't necessarily healthy for us on our phones because it's free.
Yeah.
Well, we could have said the law is you can't turn your customers into products that way. You have to charge it. There could have been a reaction, and it's sort of like bad food, right? Depending on where you live, you and I live in a place that isn't great at this respect.
Yeah.
If we lived in Europe, there would be a lot more rules about, well, you can't serve that to people. It's not real food.
Yeah.
Right. So regulate, and so this sort of brings to mind the term externalities. Which is sort of a fancy way of saying not my problem. And the government saying, well, on behalf of the people, I'm saying it is your problem. And so this is another mechanism. And I'm just wondering where you sit in terms of the organizations you work with or lead. Are they pressing for regulation? Is that one of the mechanisms you use?
Yeah. So I absolutely, everything you're describing, and it's a complex systems change that needs to happen at multiple levels, right? And so I would argue each of us as individuals has utility in when it comes to shaping the future of technology as consumers, as voters. Again, the environmental movement kind of analogy, right? Like the blue box, and like maybe the modern blue box in terms of environmental movement is our relationship with our screens, right? We all struggle with that in different ways, right? But we don't exist in isolation. We work in organizations, and and broader societies with laws and everything, right? And the change has to happen at these multiple levels, right? Because, convenience and privacy, like someone could argue that, like you could make a decision, you cannot accept those terms and everything, right? But the truth of the matter is the decisions companies have made and our regulators have made are putting, massive liens on that in different directions, right? So the change has to happen at all different levels and all different sectors. I think it has to start with us appreciating the nature of what's going on in the best way. Like imagine the environmental movement, no matter, like if we'd gone down a path where there was just individual laws and kind of like random things, and there wasn't this larger sense of the issue, then, the response would have been wholly inadequate. And I think that's where we are with our sort of, our thinking about technology right now, as we look at technologies in isolation, we look at them and think only about regulation, where really the response needs to be like the scope of the problem, the scope of the challenge and opportunity is much larger. It needs to be individual behavior. It needs to be corporate culture. It needs to be, the ethos of the community and of society. It needs to be regulation. It needs to be choices made in the design of that technology. It's like, it needs to kind of infuse everything. But the heart of it is actually realizing the nature of the whole challenge in the first place, because, just like in the environmental movement, if we hadn't awoken to that, we'd still be merrily kind of sleepwalking our way to destroying the environment. And if we don't awaken to the nature of our relationship to technology and the scope of what's required, we'll keep sleepwalking into a Black Mirror episode too, right?
Perfect. Okay. I love it. So this brings me to the last couple of questions. This has been terrific, Mark. Thank you so much. The Oxford Languages rather, defines activist as a person who campaigns to bring about political or social change.
Yeah.
Do you see tech stewardship as a form of activism?
In a way, I think like when I think about larger systems change, I think there's a role. It depends exactly what you mean by activism. You just defined it, but I think there's kind of a spectrum. I think that there's a need for kind of like the heroic activist who's like, this system's broken and they're calling out that, and it's just like, protesting in the street. I think you need that sort of thing to create cracks in systems where other things can grow, right? I personally, where I think a big bottleneck is actually much more in the mess and middle. It's not like in the extremes of the debate. It's, I don't know, 99% of people in the world are kind of, they've got competing values. Like they've got to get a paycheck and they got to take care of their family and they care about climate change and all of those different things, right? And I think like with stewardship, it's like more wherever you are in various spectrums, what are your opportunities to bend that arc towards good? So I think that this idea of stewardship, and we're developing tech stewardship. If you want to get even more philosophical, I think there's a level up where you drop tech and just say like system stewardship, like all of our societal systems. How do we become more aware of what those systems are and their impacts? How do we translate that into like our own behavioral decisions? And how do we actually kind of, sort of add that up to sort of larger shifts in how we're designing our systems as a society or technologies as a subset of that, right? And so, I don't know. I mean, words change, the meanings of change evolve over time, right? And that's one way I think actually to mark, like large scale social change or systems change. I think it actually often be marked by how the meaning of certain words change. So what did engineer mean before? What does it mean now? What could it mean in the future? Technology, environment, activist, right? I'd say at the moment, the dominant activist thing plays an important role, but is a little bit different than what we're talking about stewardship. I think you need them both and they're complementary. And, part of what the role we're playing is to just get tech stewardship out in the world into the ecosystem. You asked earlier if we were focusing on policy. Rather than focus directly on policy, we help policymakers build their tech stewardship practice. Rather than focus on activism, we would sort of help activists develop their tech stewardship world. And maybe some of them would reject it because it feels like a compromise because there's too much of a space for sort of, looking at both sides of the values. Whereas, some activists don't want that. They could so in a balance, they want to pull on one side of the rope to create those cracks. So it's at the moment, I would say stewardship is sort of filling in more of that gap that's kind of more towards activism picks up. But I don't know, my thinking on that could very well change over time too.
No, I think that's a really good, because when you talk about tension, what's a rope for, right?
Yeah.
So you're the rope between the activist and the where policy is being made or technology is being made. You're trying to draw the two interests together. So.
When, the getting back into some of the theory, like, the pedagogy of the oppressed and Paulo Coelho and that, right? It's like, when you're in a situation, like let's take individualistic and more communal societies, right? And you could take like extremes of sort of like free market, capitalistic failures or like, communist kind of like, extreme failures. Like if you're in one of those societies, you see the downfalls of that kind of like of overdoing that kind of individualistic versus collective leaning in whichever one you're in, right? So the tendency is going to be really wanting to pull on the other side of the rope really hard, right? Yeah. But ultimately, I think we need to get out of tug of wars and into saying, okay, there's actually something, there is value. Like we went down this road for a reason. There is value here. We've overdone it to the exclusion of the other value. And we need now to transcend the tug of war as opposed to just, it's not about winning the tug of war the other way. It's about transcending the tug of war. And I think that's the deeper kind of philosophical root of stewardship or tech stewardship.
So my final question is, how does one become a tech steward?
So it's kind of this neat Canadian story where, this thing called the Engineering Change Lab kind of, came into this larger space. And, we have, in a way, it almost feels like an 8-year head start on current wave that's starting to build, especially now with generative AI. And so we went from sort of exploration to prototyping tech stewardship. In the last few years, we've been looking at how to get it out in the water system. And so we started building out some central programming and some central ways to get involved. So at programs.techstewardship.com, you can actually find a practice program. It's a 12-hour asynchronous program that helps individuals launch their practice. We also offer drop-in tech stewardship practice sessions where every week you can come for this half hour and sort of have a chance to connect with another person and talk through the challenges and tensions you're feeling in your work. Sort of the, like, remember what I was saying, I felt lonely in my old work. This is one of the ways to kind of solve that. So these are some of our early initial offerings, and we've been partnering, with 30 post-secondary institutions in Canada that are either promoting some of this programming or embedding in their ethics classes or design classes or co-op programs. We're piloting with some professional associations, bringing tech stewardship into their certification and licensure processes. We're piloting with some companies, bringing it into their organization culture. So it's an individual offering that can also be used by change makers in their schools or companies or teams as well too. And so if you go on to programs.techstewardship.com, you'll see the current offerings. But the way to think of it is just as the current offerings. We're going to add more things to help people launch and maintain their practice. And it's not being designed as an organization or as a trademark thing. It's more like we're just trying to get it out in the world. So the hope is that different change makers in different professions, sectors, working on different challenges, focusing on different technologies, will take this thing that happened to come from Canadian engineers. Like, we built it for Canadian engineering, but now we've kind of open sourced it a level up so that people can actually, change makers, because we think it, this is missing not just for engineering, but for society as a whole. We're structuring in a way that people can kind of take this open source code of tech stewardship in these programs and sort of run with it in their own worlds. That's kind of our longer term scaling. So that's both a bit of the longer term philosophy of it, but also, it all starts with that individual, like with us individually starting to express those behaviors as the basic building block. And the programs.techstewardship.com is a way for you both to start with your individual behaviors, and if you're interested, to start moving on to those other levels of changing your org or your communities as well.
So thanks for that. And I'll make sure the link is in the show notes. Before I let you go, I did say that was the last question, but you've raised on the website and in our conversation the fact that this or you said it's not an organization, but tech stewardship is something that was initiated in Canada.
Yeah.
For my international listeners and viewers, I should point out that you and I are both in Canada. We're both in Toronto or near Toronto. And I'm saying it in the way that international audiences will understand, not Toronto. Why do you think that this found root in Canada first? What is there something special about Canada that makes that bloom here first?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is starting to spread more internationally too. We had a policy paper with the United Nations, accepted with the United Nations, about tech stewardship as a foundation for connecting science, technology, and innovation to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're talking with, we partnered with some international organizations, and we have participants going through the program internationally. Why Canada? I think Canada has that pluralistic strength, right? People from all over the world, different backgrounds, different cultures, in a way that I think is definitely imperfect. There's been lots of problems in history and continue to be problems, but I would say Canada is, if we look at the roughly 200 countries in the world, in terms of a country that has embraced different sort of backgrounds, different cultures, and kind of brought them together in a better way. Again, not a perfect way. I think that sort of pluralistic sort of foundation and strength is sort of lends itself really well to tech stewardship, where it's like this appreciation of different values and perspectives, and that they all bring sort of strength. And how do we actually continue to find the best, navigate a path forward that's bringing together the best of different traditions and values and perspectives, as opposed to like creating a tug of war between them.
I wonder if I wonder if you'll entertain another theory.
Yeah.
That is that we sit at the fulcrum between the U.S. and the EU.
That's very true. Yeah, like a can we do it and a should we do it?
Exactly right.
Regulatory or more free market. I think that's absolutely accurate as well too.
Well, this has been a delight. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. This was a lot of fun, and looking forward to seeing the final product.
My guest today was Mark Abbott. Mark can be reached at Mark Abbott, @engineeringchangelab.ca. The links we discussed will be in the show notes.